All right, so welcome back to the channel. I'm doing essentially a series evaluating some open source security tools to put on your radar, given that KubeCon just ended this week, right? ARMO security has been one of the areas I've been exploring. I posted a couple videos already. They also were in the space of the Kubernetes security posture management, really driving that um, area of focus of treating Kubernetes agnostically from our traditional cloud security posture management tools. So for this video specifically, I'm going to go through the installation of Kubescape. This is open source. You can use this right after this video and test it out for yourself to see what value it can provide to your organization. So what we're going to do is essentially go through a couple slides to break down what is Kubescape, right? So under the hood, it's using Open Policy Agent. You likely have heard of Open Policy Agent. The Kubernetes extension of that would be Gatekeeper, which is what Azure Policy operates on. It's heavily used for a lot of organizations, kind of refactor to and the proprietary tools, if you can say that. It's using rego expression. Now, if you want to add to the Kubescape library, I've linked what the library is right here. Now, this library is essentially representing some of the frameworks that are best practices for security specifically, right? So this is just showing an example of their libraries inputs, right? So if you want to edit that, you can kind of see how that kind of works, right? It's obviously referencing the rule language, the API groups, API versions, essentially parameters that it's looking for with a description, etc., right? So just wanted to show you what's a little under the hood. Now we'll move right into what's that installation. So breaking down what's the installation look like, we're going to look at specifically the CLI tool. You can just run this command in your CLI. This will install install Kubescape on your local cluster, and then it will also prompt you of a scan of essentially what that posture is. So this is part one, essentially showing you what the tool's about, and then we're going to move right into our demo. Okay, so we are back. I'm in Killer Coda. If you're not familiar with this platform, it allows you essentially a sandbox of Kubernetes environments. It also has tutorials. I highly recommend you check out Killer Coda. Thank you for providing this browser experience. I don't have to constantly create clusters and rack up charges. This is free of charge, so you can definitely leverage this for your learning of Kubernetes. So without further ado, we'll jump right into it. So I already have the command pre-populated, as you can see. I'm going to run that. We're going to install Kubescape. So if we can see, it's going to go through this installation. It's going to say executing Kubescape, right? And it's going to initialize the scanner. Once that is complete, right, it's going to scan and give us essentially what the posture is of our cluster. So what we're going to see here is the compliance based on the MITRE framework and the NSA framework. We have a 68.57, 78.16, right? So some things I want to take a look at. Now, the really cool thing is it breaks down, and I'm going to zoom in. Let me increase the text on this so we can see this better. Okay, let me do one more. Okay, so if you can see specifically, it gives you a breakdown similar to when we run Trippy, right? It gives you the control plane. It tells you the API server is insecure. The port's enabled with a check mark, right? Anonymous access is enabled, so it's bad. You want to make sure that that's good to go. You want to make sure all these are green, that these are good to go. Secret etcd encryption enabled, right? You want to make sure that that's enabled. So if you're storing secrets, or if you're using an external secrets management such as HashiCorp Vault, right, or sealed secrets in that realm. And the same thing with audit logs. You want to ensure that you have a point of presence to trail, or what I call a choke point as far as detection engineering goes, what exactly that breaks down to. And then it goes into essentially categories. So when we're looking at access control, right, it'll tell you specifically what that control name is, the resource, and then it gives you a reference too. So for data destruction, right, so I can run essentially this command. I can copy that. Now again, it's also going to tell you down here specifically what that looks like if you want to run some more highest stakes workloads. So this will tell you what to focus on. So your daemon sets, right? Your Calico queue controller. So that means we're running Calico and the CNI on the back end, right? The local path storage, right? So areas to essentially focus your attention to, but also be aware, right? It will tell you even if it's missing network policy, that's a big one, right? Out of the box, right? This is a brand new cluster, so I got a lot of work to do, right? But it makes you aware. Now, the great thing is I can obviously use that. I can run Kubescape scan control, right? And then I'm going to get more detailed output. So if you can see here, and let me just go to the largest volume here. So we can see, let me go back, data destruction. So we can see it's affecting a service account. We can see what that namespace is, how it did fail in that regard, right? And then the assisted remediation, so related objects, right? Rules, resource, rules, verbs. It'll give you some documentation. So I'm just going to click through this and we'll see what that documentation entails, right? So if I need any more information, it points me in the right direction. Now this will tell you essentially what that check's running against, right? So out of 71 resources, I have one resource that is essentially non-compliant in that regard, and it gives you out a summary. At night, it also puts a color code that you can see and work with what exactly you want to do with that, right? But also making sure it pops out to you. So if we go to data destruction, we can see the reference to that control specifically. And then it talks about remediation. You should follow least privilege, right, and minimize the number of subjects that can delete resources. So this essentially talks about limiting the access of who can delete those resources, right? So this will tell you essentially that role or referencing a role, calling that API the RBAC authorization, the namespace specifically, essentially an example of pod exec, and then when we obviously see the star, we've are familiar with JSON at this point. That means all, right, in that regard for secrets, pods, services, etc. And then they're looking for what exactly can delete and delete collection. So that it's telling you essentially the logic of what it looks for to populate that, right? Now, again, it will tell you what the severity is, what framework as well. So it's not like these are arbitrary, you're coming out of nowhere, things of that nature, right? And you definitely want to check what subjects have delete collections on RBAC permissions on workloads, right? So this can be a number of areas that we can investigate. So let's say, for instance, we wanted to investigate this, right? We can run a kubectl get cluster roles. Now we can see all the roles, right? So now we want to make sure that if we go back, let's do that scan one more time, see if we can get related subject. So a service account, the local path provisioner, right? So we can look at this specific service account, and it's in kubectl get service account, and we have a namespace that that service account is isolated to, right? The local path storage. Okay, so kubectl, let's so we can see where that is, right? And then now we can put a question mark there. Let's do kubectl describe service account local path provisioner. And local path storage. So, okay, we can see essentially what the namespace are, but let's see if let's edit this. So we can see that. Let's kubectl get service accounts, and let's look at our local path storage. Let's look at all the service accounts associated with that. So it's just the default and the local path, right? So for every role, there's essentially, you can have a role or a cluster role. A role can be isolated to a namespace. A cluster role with the word cluster essentially plainly states that you have full control of the entire cluster, or that scope to the entire cluster. So it's not bound when we're thinking isolation using namespaces, right? So now we can run kubectl. Let's do get roles, and let's see what it is called to in the local path storage. So there's no resources. Okay, so let's also kubectl edit. Let's edit the local path storage. Now again, I might run into something because this is a default out of the box. So in the back end, when you initiate the sandbox cluster, right, this is a default configuration. So I'm not too concerned, but I definitely want to see a little bit more about this, right? So the annotations, the resource versions. Now, when you see our place of editing here, namespace, right, local kind service account. And to reiterate what we're looking at, right, if we do a kubectl get cluster roles, we can see all the roles associated on the cluster, right? Now, these roles are essentially going to be the interactions that actually allow us to leverage any portion of our cluster, right? These are essentially the bloodline of making certain service connections to parts of our cluster. So you can see you have your kube scheduler, your DNS, your bootstrapper, right, proxier, etc. So there's a lot. And obviously when you see system, this is related to the system. Now we do see the local path provisioner role, right? Now, and then we also have our admin roles a little bit further, right? That should be leveraged. So cluster roles. And then we're going to run a grep local. All right, okay. So now let's edit our cluster roles local path provisioner role. So we can see essentially what that role's capabilities are. So we're allowing it to create, patch any storage classes, right? It can look further. Okay, and it ends there. It can also list specifically to the resources listed here. So when we have our nodes, persistent volumes, config maps, it can watch. We can also look at the resources associated endpoints, persistent volumes, and pods. And this verb all, right? Now, obviously you want to limit this. In this context, I'm going to let this one ride. However, right, should we want to limit this area here, because when we think about our pods, right, it's likely the interaction with this is going to be needed. However, right, it should just be tailored to what our case-to-case basis is. So if this verb is, for instance, create, right, if we reference back, just make sure I don't mess anything up here. First, we look for one of these verbs, or that's verbs delete or delete collection. So we probably should just have a verb that is create list watch, essentially. Now let me go back. List watch. Let's see if this causes anything. So now it's going to tell us it's edited. Now let's run that scan one more time. Let's go back in our control. And now we can see that control is essentially mitigated, right? So we limit that. So that is essentially how you would go about this, right? It tells you what exactly the issue is. We investigate it further. We lowered our risk. Now our resources are showing compliant, right? Now, another thing too, Kubescape, let's see here, you can essentially also with the command line, you can run specifically list controls, download artifacts, look at the views. Now, this will tell you essentially the usage of it, right? Very useful. Now, if the color bugs you, right, you can disable the color. I really like the color, so I think that's one of the better things about a lot of these tools is adding where the context is, right? Because we have a lot of noise that we need to get through. So if we go through Kubescape and let's do scan. And let's see a new scan, right? Obviously, we made a correction, right? So our scores should go up. Now, again, some things might not, right? Perhaps there's a communication error. So now we can go a little bit further and look at our workloads, right? We have non-root containers, right? So likely is some containers that are more. Well, we also have a privileged container. We definitely want to see that. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so we have one high out of 9 resources, right? We have one that's failed. Now for privilege, the reason why this is always a big issue is because if it is privileged, it can run as root, right? Should that pod become compromised or taken over, it could be a long day, as I say. Now this appropriate control is related to a daemon set, as we can see here, kernel kube system. So let's take a look at that. Right now, again, I'm just going to take a look at this. I'm going to show you a deployment. I'm going to see if it pops up with the Kubescape as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to clear this out, and let me get this context, get kubectl, get daemon sets. kube system. Okay, so we can see now, right? So that is the daemon set. So let's do kubectl daemon sets kube system, and let's run. Okay, so now we can see what that daemon set looks like. So we can see our annotations here, right? If you ever see this breakup here of this API version apps, essentially when you're editing any type of configuration, this pops up typically when things are already deployed. This will populate. So, for instance, if I do a dry run on a kubectl pod for like Nginx, right, and it's deployed, and then I edit that in real time, this annotation will essentially populate on its own throughout the system. So don't fret. Okay. Now let's go down to the specs and look at what we're looking at. So we're looking at our template. We have our specs container, and then the environment. So this is pretty normal, right? Use podcider, wait for data store, Calico, CNI service account. So essentially our whole configuration here, right? Image pull policy. And so right here, we see that it is running for security context privilege, right? I'm pretty sure if I put this as false, there will be some issues. So I'm not going to do that, just out of caution. I don't want to continue this without disruption. So let me just exit out of here. Okay, and what we're going to do is I'm going to show you what I have. So I've made a folder here essentially with a couple configuration items. So the first one is baseline. So we'll do cat baseline.yaml. And this is just to show you I pulled this from the documentation on enforcing, showing you what the labels are for baseline of the labels annotation. So essentially you have restricted, you have your baseline, and then privileged, and these will enforce certain policies on the actual workload that you're running. Now again, for the network portion, I wanted to deploy a network policy to see if Kubescape picks that up, right? So I'm going to deploy that. So we can see here I just had a default deny all. I'm just denying all traffic, right? Typically, this is a good baseline to start with to start understanding, okay, what is actually inbound, outbound. I'm not saying that this could be disruptive, okay? So I'm going to deploy this and run Kubescape, and we'll see if that picks that up, okay? So let's run kubectl apply, and let's run network.yaml. Okay, so now we've created our policy, and we can see that if we run kubectl get network policies, we have that deployed, and then again those 9 seconds. So now let's run our Kubescape scan. Okay, loaded exceptions, account configurations, and again for the exceptions as well, right? Similar to how we're finding this, you can run through here and look for what those findings are. So it says missing network security policy or network policy, and that's what I thought would fix it. But let's get some more context. Okay, so for the pod, labeled Kube API server, our control plane essentially, it doesn't have a network policy, right? So this will tell you if it's medium 4. So out of 24 resources, 4 of them are missing that network policy. So that's where we would have to apply that, right? Now, as you can see, that last network policy that I did, let me bring that up there. This is for that namespace, we put the pod selector as all essentially in that context, but we can also tailor this to that namespace for the API server control plane. However, this might be a little disruptive since this is the API server. But let's attempt to do that, and we'll see if that changes it. Okay, so why don't we run a kubectl nano. I use nano. I know some people don't like nano, but it's faster for me. So let's run a kubectl namespace system. And what was that called one more time? Let me, Kube API server control plane. Just going to copy that so I don't mess with it. Okay. And now let's run, we have to apply that configuration again to our service, right? So let's, oh, cannot be handled. Go to struct label selector. Okay, so let's go back. Let's troubleshoot. Now, you're always going to run into some type of error, and that's always normal with some stuff, especially YAML. It's a little bit of cumbersome. So we'd have namespace, pod selector, match labels. Okay, so let's go back and let's take a look. So we have our namespace. So our pod selector probably has to be a little fleshed out. So let's do I'm just going to copy this so I have. Uh-oh. Oh no. Okay. Okay. So, all right, we're back. We're back. So we're going to space this out. We're going to do match labels. And let me take a look at that specific pod. Kubectl get pods, kube system. And so we're looking for our kube API control plane. All right, so okay, the label is component kube API server. We can use that as telling our network policy where we're at. So for the role, that will change to component. And let me just make sure I type that in right. Okay, kube API server. All right, so now we should get that back as okay, but let's see. Okay, that was one resource, right? And now we have some others that we'd have to fix. So if you can see, that went down from 4 to 3, right? Again, this would be working through this, but the great thing is it actually gives you context so you can quickly identify, right? When I run scan specifically, I can get that output again that we got at the beginning. Now, the great thing is, especially for the highest stake workloads, they would have the highest impact should they be exploited, right? So our daemon set in our kube system for candle, right? So let's run this and let's get an output for that workload and show you what that looks like. Scanning image, as you can see, this is pulling from Docker, Calico image. And once this comes back, this will essentially give us what Kubescape deems our highest stake workloads. I think this is pretty useful because similarly, as I said earlier, we definitely get a lot of noise in security. So being able to identify what is our highest stakes, but also how can we remediate it, right, is going to be really the first step of securing our cluster and ensuring that our day 2 operations are a success. Now this one's taking a little bit of time, so I'm going to let this hang for a second. Additionally, I just wanted to get you up and running, show you what Kubescape is, show you how we would remediate some of those findings, and then as you can see here, you can also view a full compliance report. So similar to when I was in the ARMO dashboard, right, that's more that SaaS offering. The Kubescape, the CLI is essentially free, the open source software. Should you want to check this out, I'll link this GitHub in here, and this runs through some of the documentation, as you can see, with more of a how-to real quickly, similar to what I'm going through, but I wanted to show you some hands-on of actually fixing things that it does find to show you, that it's not just a tool that tells me what's wrong, it tells me where it's at, and then how we would actually fix that, okay? Hopefully you found this useful. Let me know in the comments if there's any other tools you'd like me to review, evaluate. I'm always happy to try something out, specifically for Kubernetes security and demonstrate some of the capabilities to help out organizations in this area.